If you're in the early years of motherhood and trying to give your children a beautiful education while also providing time to nurture yourself, check out the Peaceful Press resources. The Peaceful Preschool and Nourishing Nature Kindergarten both include simple daily activities with things around your house that really encourage motor skills and just a peaceful learning rhythm so that you and your children can bond. There can be a lot of connection, but there's also margin for you to take care of your physical and spiritual needs as well. And if you want a resource for nurturing spiritual formation in your family, check out the Good Gospel. It includes 26 Bible stories on the life of Jesus, along with crafts, memory verses, and some song suggestions. Resources like the Good Gospel, the Peaceful Preschool and Nourishing Nature Kindergarten, as well as my books, Mothering by the Book and Habits for a Sacred Home, are wonderful opportunities for you as a mom to feed your spirit, take care of your children while also having margin for rest. This is Jennifer Pepito with the Restoration Home podcast. This is the show where we talk about the peaceful path to connected families and restored communities. Today on the show, I'm excited to be chatting with my daughter, Emelie Pepito, about the virtue of obedience. This is honestly a little bit of a hard topic because, in our modern way of thinking, obedience almost seems like a dirty word. Like we're supposed to sort of be self actualized and everyone kind of do their own thing and be led on their own. But there are all these verses in the Bible that talk about, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Submit yourself to every ordinance. There are so many verses that talk about this virtue of obedience. And yet, we also have all these examples of cult leaders and people who abused authority. And so it can be a tough one for us as modern Christian women to navigate. I'd love to hear your initial thoughts, Emily, because when we were raising you older kids, especially, we were in a much more authoritative or maybe even authoritarian parenting culture. And so obedience was very emphasized, first time obedience. And there was a season where I actually thought that our being so, like, kind of so attentive as a family to obedience and, doing things right was even part of your struggle with eating disorder. I'd love for you to speak to that.
Yeah, I really appreciate the training we had in obedience because everything in life requires, I think, some level of to be successful, submission and obedience. And whether it's submission to God and submission to what He's calling you to do, I think as women, whether we like it or not, we are in a better place when we are in a healthy submission to our spouses. And sometimes that looks like, again, it's such a scary thing to say it looks like obedience to your husband, but it's like, like you and dad have done it a couple times where you have made a move and it's more about your obedience to both God and to your husband's authority that has really inspired you to follow in that move more than your own sense of um delight, meaning, or even feeling yourself compelled to go. And I don't think that being taught to be obedient had any mal effects on me. I think it has taught me to be under authority and taught me to be in authority. And I think it's um, given me a lot of tools for success because I understand the importance of quick responses to employers or being being able to listen and hear and be responsive to the people around me. I think obviously dictatorships are really unhealthy. But yeah, I would be a big proponent, I think, of teaching your children first time obedience. And I think the other thing about obedience is that it's especially for young children, and this goes back to boundaries, which is not exactly what we're talking about today. But obedience and a child knowing that they're expected to obey is a sense of safety for a young child of like, if I say this and if I am told to do this, I must obey. And it just gives them the structure I think that young children really need and that we're actually being cruel and depriving small children of.
Yeah, I think that is a really important thing to note here. And I just, to your point about me doing a couple of moves, the first big one was moving to Mexico, which I didn't want to do that. Like, I loved my life. We lived in this property. We had lived on 11 acres in the forest, and we had this little creek. And it was just, I talked about it in Mothering by the Book. It was really, in many ways, my dream life. And then my husband felt God was calling us to Mexico, but I didn't just go because my husband felt that. There were ways that God spoke to my heart as well. And I think that is really important for women who are in a season where maybe their husband has a vision for something and you're not necessarily feeling it, to go to God yourself and ask God to show you, like give you kind of a clarity, speak to your heart. I remember one of the big moments for me, actually. We were camping down in like Newport Beach or something. Well, my husband went on an exploratory trip into Mexico with one of his missionary mentors. And I was wrestling through all of this. Like, I didn't really want to go. And we were in this campground. We heard Christian music on Sunday morning. And I was in the camp. I was in a camper by myself with 5 young children, and so I got up in the morning and I walked you guys towards the music. I was like, let's go towards the Christian music. And it happened to be Rock Harbor Church doing a service with Matt Redman leading worship live. And that's when that song, Blessed Be Your Name, on the road marked with suffering. And in many ways, that was a very marking moment for me to have God speak to me about sacrifice in a sense. And, in the last move that we did, my husband lost his job through no bad behavior on his part. He won a safety award. And then because we'd already had COVID, because we had a child who was vaccine injured, we declined the COVID vaccine, and he was fired from his job for that. He'd gotten a safety award, he'd gotten COVID and recovered from it at work, but was still fired from his job. And so that set our family on this new, like, very unknown trajectory, which it was an interesting season because a few years earlier we had been in Israel on a ministry trip. We were with an intercessor group from a church on this beautiful tour of Israel. And when we were in this missionary prayer house, I felt like God told me to, sort of turn my heart away from this almost idolatry I had for my husband's job, because after we were missionaries, I just hated being dependent on other people. I hated not, not feeling any freedom financially. Like, we had people judge us because we would get a coffee, or there were people who just didn't like supporting missionaries probably. And so I never wanted to be in that kind of dependent state again. And I know a lot of you who listen to this podcast are missionaries, you're pastors' wives, you understand what I'm saying with this, like, sort of scrutiny over your finances by people who you serve. And so I never wanted to do that again. And I had in many ways probably made my husband's job an idol, because it was such a good job, amazing benefits, really tons of vacation time. It was really not that taxing of a job in so many ways. And then God took it away. And you do have to look and see, where is the hand of God in the new path he's calling me to. And for me in that season, like, we had looked at leaving the state of California because things were so crazy here. We had looked at all kinds of possibilities, and I recognized as a woman that the future is a little shaky. Like, I had lived through COVID in California. I understood that I do not exactly know what is the right path. Like, I do not exactly know what could happen tomorrow. And that gave me, honestly, a sense of awe and wonder, and also not an unhealthy fear, but a little fear and trepidation about doing God's will. And so ultimately my husband is responsible for his family. He's responsible if he makes a wrong move. He's responsible. However, if I force us, like, if we were making this move, we moved to a new town so he could do some ministry school. If I said, I'm not doing that, I'm staying in my house because I love my house, then I would be the one responsible if it went bad. And I didn't want that kind of responsibility in a season in the world where things are so shaky and uncertain. And so if you as a mom are in that same season, I got on my face before God. I asked for direction. I actually looked back in a journal, and several years earlier I had said I'd written in a journal that I felt like we would be living in this town. And I still don't really want to be here. Like I want to be home in my old town, but I'm doing my best in this season to be obedient to what I feel like God is calling us to in this season, and honor my husband. And I know that God will reward. It says he will reward those who diligently seek him. And we really cannot predict the future. We really cannot tell what will happen, when, what kind of good or bad things could happen to our family. And so to me, there is a safety in being under authority. And for all of you, that's going to look different. For each family, that's going to look different. But I think that is one thing, as you're trying to teach your children to obey, that is one thing that you can talk to them about, is just showing them places in scripture where, Moses obeyed God and led people to freedom. Noah obeyed God and saved people from the flood. In the scriptures, you can see where people obeyed God despite how nonsensical it might have seemed, and God rewarded them for their faithfulness.
Yeah, and it's in Deuteronomy 30 it says, and he's talking about God driving them out, and it's basically when he's saying, if you follow my commandments, you'll be blessed. If you don't, then these things shall come to pass. And then he says, and when the blessing and then the curse have come to pass because of the disobedience, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children with you, and with all your heart, with all your soul, then the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations. And this language of obedience is over and over and over again in scripture. And I think we do live in a time when we are saturated and inundated with stories of untrustworthy leaders, untrustworthy husbands, untrustworthy fathers, untrustworthy spiritual leaders, untrustworthy political leaders. And so there's this sense of hyper independence. If nobody can be trusted, that it is almost you're almost being foolish to put yourself under the authority of someone. And I think you have to be, wise as a serpent, gentle as a dove when you choose who to be under in submission under. But if you are married, and again, there's always exceptions, but in general, when you are married, I think you're choosing to be in submission, therefore under the authority of your husband through God, sanctified by God, because of God. And so, yes, like your husband might be fallible, but there is a sanctification process that God is doing in you by allowing you to go through the growth and even the trials of sometimes being in submission to an imperfect man. And it's like we either believe as Christians, and this is maybe something that not everybody agrees, but we either believe that God is in control and is redeeming and redemptive of our stories, and therefore we can trust him, and in that trust obey him even when we don't understand, even when it's hard, even when the person that we believe is speaking, like the person who is in authority to us via the ordinance of God, is having us process or go through something like moving that is outside our desire, our comfort realm. Just having this childlike faith that obedience will be blessed, that he will bless us. And I think one thing with obedience that you have to have is you've got to have an eternity mindset, because if you don't think in terms of the long term, if you're just like, what will make me feel good this year, this month, this week, this is going to be hard today, tomorrow, for this year, then being obedient in the face of cost is going to be really, really hard. But if we can change our mindset and start to have an eternity driven mindset where we're like, this time on earth is so ephemeral. It's a tiny part of our of what we're working towards. We're working towards eternity with God, which means that our time on earth is a breath. And having that mindset of like, I'm being obedient at maybe a great cost for the sake of eternity, and being able to shift that. And like one of my like one of my big life dreams has always been to live in the UK, and I want like a cottage in the UK. And it's just there's something, it's magic. If you've ever been there and you've been to like the Cotswolds or just different parts of it, there's a magic to it that is indescribable, and that's my dream. And I'm currently, in a relationship with somebody whose heart is not in that place. That's not what they want. They have a very clear idea of what they want. And it's been such a process for me because you're dating, and so I have the opportunity to stay or leave. It's a different story. And I feel so overwhelmed in this season by God's like insistence on me staying. And not like I'm like, "Oh, I don't want to be with this person," but just like his blessing on the relationship and his his heart towards the relationship, where I'm like, this is like, I know, like I feel very seen by God, and I feel like he's like, I know what this could cost you in terms of your dreams, but this is where I'm planting you, and showing me just a vision for it. But in that, so often when I'm going to God in my personal time and I'm praying, when I like need to encounter him, the place he keeps encountering me is this beautiful English cottage in this beautiful garden. And I have such, and he's just so clearly like, I see you, and I know you, and I know your heart's desires, and I know that this obedience is costing you this dream, but I've not forgotten you. I've not forgotten your dreams. And I think we have to be able to, especially as women with so many dreams for ourselves, for our children, for our marriage, wanting things to be beautiful. Like, that's core to being a woman. And we have to be able to lean into God, and because he will comfort us, I think, in that obedience, and he will step by step so gently comfort our hearts as he walks us through what is for us probably the greatest sanctification, which is the submission process.
Yeah, and I love, Emily, that you mentioned how you're bringing your wants and your needs to God, because this is really the key right here to living a life of obedience, is that we are continually going to God and asking him, because I in Habits for a Sacred Home, in the chapter on order, I talk about some of the families that we've known where, a church leader told a woman to stay with an alcoholic and abusive husband, or another, a chaplain abandoned his wife claiming God told him to. There are examples we can see where people abused authority. And so we as women have to, instead of just sort of, it's not blind obedience that we're called to. It's going to God, the God who dwells in us, the God who speaks to us, and seeing what does his word say, and what is he saying to us right now in this situation, because there's not a clear path. Like, the Bible has overarching principles, but it doesn't say when you should, you know, obey your husband, and when you should say, "Hey, actually, I feel like your idea right here is going to be really damaging to our family. And so can you talk to one of our elders about it? Or can you talk to a counselor about it?" It's not clear in scripture exactly which move to make when, because we do have a lot of tools in our toolkit. Sometimes the thing that will turn your marriage around is just being a little bit more thankful and respectful. But sometimes the thing that you need is to have somebody confront your husband, or to have like a pretty strong boundary. And so these important steps in relationships are only going to come, the wisdom's only going to come through our relationship with the Lord. And I love also that you talked, Emily, about with our children, because for one thing, we give our children this sense of safety when we are good leaders, when we help them feel like we have it under control. But if we are emotionally out of control, that creates a sense of fear. And I obviously did that a lot in you guys' upbringing, with the way fear would bring big emotions or big reactions from me. But also with our children, we can see in stories, like, I love how literature informs us, because in the Peaceful Press, we read these stories like The Little House on the Prairie or Shackleton's Endurance. And in these books, we see how even in hardship, when there was order, people got through it with much less harm done. We were just listening to Shackleton's Endurance last night. We've read it out loud several times with the Kind Kingdom, but we were listening to it last night. And they had to live on ice floes for, I think it was a year that they were their ship was trapped in the ice and they had to abandon ship and live on ice floes, and it was this terrible, terrible, terrible. We can't even comprehend. Like, go sit outside for 24 hours when it's 30 degrees below zero. See what that's like. I mean, we can't even comprehend. And meanwhile, eat seal blubber and your own pets. Like, it was a terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy experience. But because there was strong leadership, because Shackleton was in charge, Frank Wild was under Shackleton's authority, those men were able to create a sense of safety and hope and inspiration for all of their crew, and all 26 men made it to safety. I've said this before on the podcast, I'll say it again. It's just such an incredible survival story, but a big part of their survival depended on the authority structure that was in place. And so I think for us in our families, like, if we can start to understand what it looks like to be under the authority of God, and to lead our children with authority, to stop being wishy-washy about leading our children, and stop being almost lazy about it. It's so easy to just be like, oh, it's too hard to get them to listen to me. And I think, this applies, like, even in our homeschool morning time. For instance, if you want to give your children a virtue based, literature based education, you're going to have to be able to lead. Like, if you can't even get your children to sit down while you read a picture book out loud, or while you read a verse of the Bible out loud, you're going to have a really hard time homeschooling them. You can give them some online curriculum, but that's not going to teach virtue. Maybe you can get them to work through a workbook, but it's not going to teach virtue in the same way that you guys gathering together, sitting together, reading books and talking about them is going to really help them understand what it looks like to live a beautiful, godly, hopeful, redemptive life, a purposeful life, a life of vision and hope. That can only come through the conversations and the stories that you share with a curriculum like the Playful Pioneers, the Kind Kingdom curriculum that features beautiful characters who lived heroic lives. And as you do that, you give your children a vision for a heroic life they could live. You help them fight against the creeping apathy and narcissism and nihilism that is so prominent in our culture today. But it only happens when you start with baby steps, just saying, hey, today we're going to read one story together, and then we're all going to have tea time. Or today we're going to read one page of the Bible, and then we all get to go outside and play. Like, start off with making it fun, start with making it a game, play things like Simon Says or Mother May I, or, have little challenges, give out little rewards. Training in obedience can happen slowly, just 1% improvement at a time. That's why in the Restoration Home community will open again in July, we work on really small habits like chore chart follow through. We work on, checking up on how their room care is. We work on having a daily Bible time. That's what we're working on in the month of April, is having a daily Bible time where you read the Bible and pray together. And as you start these small habits, these small adjustments, and start to help your children have that sense of safety and comfort from knowing you're in charge, you can start to create a more hopeful, redemptive, and peaceful family culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the order that comes with teaching obedience. And I think be the leader that you be the leader that you want to have as well. And a lot of times I think the thing that happens with homeschool parents and even Christian parents is that and I think this is why a lot of people are scarred from obedience, is that they had a somewhat volatile parent who sometimes demanded obedience, sometimes didn't demand any obedience, or demanded obedience over really small things like, no, you can't have a snack before bed. And then the kid, keeps asking and they're like, I gotta obey me, and over really trivial things. And I think it's a way of leading and a way of expecting obedience that is really easy to fall into when you're burnt out and overwhelmed. And so, again, we've talked about it so much on this podcast, but if you keep margin, it's easy for you to keep a little bit of awareness of what you're requiring your children to be obedient over. And so then you avoid being a harsh taskmaster and expecting things of them that are unreasonable for their age or their state of tiredness or their state of hunger. I think the best thing with obedience too is being very cognizant of when you're expecting obedience. Like if it's late at night and the kids are exhausted, don't set them up to be disobedient by virtue of their exhaustion and your overwhelm. And, same thing for just everyday things. And the other thing about obedience is that if you were raised in a culture where obedience was first time always, and there was no negotiation, and you have shied too far away, I think there is a middle ground of like, time to get dressed, and your kid's like, I'm not getting dressed, and you're like, well, you can get dressed now, or you can get dressed in 5 minutes, you can choose. And then when the 5 minutes goes by, then you're like, okay, now we are getting dressed. And so there's leeway to have these conversations, especially as your kids get older, and to work with them. But just don't let them think that obedience is what's what I'm looking for? Sporadically requiring obedience is very damaging for children. And being a taskmaster or creating overwhelm by expecting obedience when it is unreasonable to expect it is another way of creating overwhelm. So
Yeah.
that would be
So
a practical.
that's such a good reminder because the Bible also says, bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And this is why the Peaceful Press recommends doing the connection challenge. Like if your children aren't listening to you at all, try that, because taking time to look your children in the eyes so they know that you care about them, taking time to give them a hug every day so they feel connected to you. And then, spending some leisure time outside with them, reading aloud to them an engaging book. And if they're not even willing to listen to books out loud, try starting with reading a joke to them, or try starting with, just telling them a little story about them in their childhood. Just start small, start with these small improvements. And if you are looking for a resource that will help you teach virtue in your home, help you inspire your children through beautiful and hopeful stories, check out the Peaceful Press curriculum. You can use code restoration10 to get started and get 10% off your purchase. Most families, if they're doing the Peaceful Press curriculum for the first time and their children are in elementary school, they use the Playful Pioneers. We read the Little House on the Prairie stories out loud, which are so much fun to listen to. And then each week there'll be a science or geography or history story that kind of goes along with what you're learning. Most of those are actually available as YouTube read aloud. So you could even sit with your children and watch the video on YouTube. And then it includes art and poetry and recipes and projects each week. It's just such a fun and engaging homeschool year. So if you're getting started with literature-based learning, if you're getting started homeschooling and you have children in elementary school, start with the Playful Pioneers. If you are getting started with a preschool or kindergarten student, check out the Peaceful Preschool. Our Peaceful Preschool and Nourishing Nature Kindergarten are award-winning resources for the early years. We have included large motor and fine motor skills activities, and it's going to really help your children get set up for success in school with these fun, engaging motor skills activities. And it makes your children want to do school. It'll be easier to build that habit of doing homeschooling together when you started out with such fun resources. So thank you so much, Emily, for this valuable conversation today. I adore you. I'm so glad you're my daughter. I love you so much. I'm so glad we get to have these conversations together. And these conversations that Emily and I have, they started in the living room with our morning time. You also can have these kind of conversations with your children and just start small.